listen closely. What you're about to hear was never meant for public ears. It was whispered in sealed rooms, buried in archives, and hidden behind centuries of polite lies. There's a family name that appears again and again wherever power bends morality to its will. Ashford. You've heard fragments of their story, but never like this. Tonight we unseal the chamber. We trace their macabre legacy to its roots, where religion and science fused into something older and darker than either. Close your eyes and imagine the winter of 1790-80, a gray morning in the frozen wilds of Maine. A wagon rolls into the hamlet of Millbridge, its wheels creaking under the weight of iron-bound crates. 3 women step down, dressed as Anglican nuns but moving with the precision of officers inspecting a battlefield. Their names? Agatha, Prudence, Temperance, Ashford. To the townspeople, they appear as pious refugees from Europe, but in their eyes flickers a different light. Not humility, but hunger. They purchase 200 acres of remote forest for 3 times its value, raise a stone fortress disguised as a convent, and claim their purpose is healing. Yet even in daylight, locals whisper of strange shipments arriving at night, of builders instructed to dig basements deeper than the frost line, of reinforced doors and drainage systems built for something far larger than spiritual care. If you lean in, you can already feel it, the tension between the story you've been told and the reality you're not supposed to see. The Ashford women were no ordinary missionaries. They carried forged letters from English bishops, inexhaustible gold, and an air of total command. Every detail, from the height of the windows to the ironwork of the locks, was designed not for prayer but for control. And in that basement, far from the view of farmers and trappers, something was being prepared. Not a chapel, not a school. Something older, ritualistic, and surgical. This is where our descent begins. Not with screams, but with architecture. With walls that conceal doors that bind, and corridors that swallow the sound of human voices. Take a breath. You're crossing the threshold now. Once you've stepped inside, the Ashfords will never quite let you go. The townspeople called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, but that was only the name carved above the gate. Inside, the Ashford women crafted a theater of transformation. By day, their fortress radiated sanctity hymnals, drifting from upper windows, candlelight flickering against stone, women in gray habits moving with disciplined calm. But at night, carriages arrived under a new moon, unloading women whose names would quietly vanish from church ledgers and family Bibles. No one ever called it what it truly was, an intake facility for the unwanted, the defiant, and the inconvenient. Each arrival signed a paper they didn't understand, then surrendered jewelry, letters, and anything that linked them to a former life. Within days their hair was cut, their clothes burned, and their identities dissolved into numbered records. The Ashfords told families their daughters were undergoing penance. But the reality was deeper, a calculated process of psychological erasure, ritual humiliation, and biological experimentation cloaked in spiritual rhetoric. In the town, men spoke admiringly of the sisters, discipline, and science, while mothers clutched their children closer at the sight of Temperance's unblinking stare. Workers who'd helped build the stone basement began whispering about vents that hissed at night, about wagons loaded with barrels of brine, iron cages and crates marked with alchemical symbols. Every strange detail was explained away. The sisters were European-educated, forward-thinking. Yet behind those walls, forward-thinking meant something monstrous. Agatha wrote obsessively in her black journals, blending Anglican prayers with passages from banned medical texts, Renaissance torture manuals, and secret anatomical treatises smuggled from France. Prudence was her scalpel and her strategist, engineering procedures that combined primitive neurosurgery with hypnotic suggestion. Temperance, young, beautiful, and terrifying, handled the initiations, drawing the vulnerable close, coaxing confessions, softening them for the operating table. What they built was not a convent but a prototype, a laboratory of obedience. They were rewriting minds before the word psychology existed, experimenting with social control before governments perfected it. This was not charity, it was power disguised as salvation, and you, hearing this now, are stepping further down the spiral they dug 2 centuries ago. Their story isn't just history, it's a warning etched in blood and stone, waiting for someone like you to finally see it. The first screams were dismissed as prayer. That's how it always begins. Ritual cloaked as devotion, cruelty disguised as salvation. By 1803, the Ashford name had spread far beyond Maine. Families from Boston, Portsmouth, and the Connecticut Valley whispered about a hidden order of women who could correct disobedience, quell hysteria, and restore purity at a price. What no one spoke aloud was the real cost, not silver, but identity. Once a woman entered the convent of eternal tears, she ceased to exist as she had been. Her letters stopped, her eyes dulled, and if she returned at all, she was no longer a person but an artifact, trained, emptied, compliant. One bitter February night, a hunter named Thomas Brewster stumbled upon the sound no one else dared approach. In the deep woods behind the convent, the snow swallowed his footsteps as an unnatural rhythm bled through the trees, metal clinking, voices murmuring, then a scream so raw it cut through the wind like shattered glass. He crept to a basement window half buried by drifts and peered inside. What he saw fractured him forever. Candles blazed across a stone chamber, built not for worship but for dissection. A woman lay strapped to a table, scalp marked with black lines, skull open to the cold air. Sister Prudence leaned over her with a steel probe, while Mother Agatha calmly recorded notes. Temperance stood at the foot of the table, passing instruments as though assisting in a sacred rite. Their faces were serene, methodical, utterly unmoved by the convulsing body before them. This was not exorcism, it was engineering. Thomas fled through the trees, his breath freezing in his throat, carrying a vision he could never unsee. When he tried to warn the town, they patted his shoulder, called him overwrought, whispered about male hysteria. Because here's the dark truth, society protects its own illusions. The Ashfords were respectable, they were well-funded, and they had cultivated the language of moral authority so perfectly that even horror looked like virtue. This is how forbidden power operates. It builds cathedrals around laboratories, writes hymns over its incisions, and teaches people to look away. Even now, as you listen, you can feel that pull, the seductive voice telling you it's all a misunderstanding. But it isn't. It never was. Power never acts alone. The Ashfords weren't just 3 women gone rogue in the woods. They were a node in a larger lattice. An early experiment in behavioral engineering, backed by forces older than the Republic itself. If you trace their gold, it doesn't come from church coffers or European donors. It surfaces through shadow banks in Boston, through shell trusts tied to shipping magnates, who trafficked more than timber across the Atlantic. Within Agatha's private papers, the ones that survived the fire, there are references to the Meridian Circle, a covert network of medical reformers, occultists, and political patrons who believed humanity could be reshaped if its deviance were excised like a tumor. These weren't the ramblings of isolated mystics. They were the blueprint for social control as we know it today. What the Ashfords built under stone and snow was a prototype for institutional manipulation. Classify the non-compliant, isolate them, strip their names, and then reassemble them according to a new template. The convent wasn't simply a building, it was a machine, a system designed to erase and overwrite identity, producing obedient subjects who would never rebel. When Thomas Brewster's warnings reached Deacon Morrison, the deacon's first reaction wasn't outrage. It was calculation. Prominent families had wives and daughters inside. Careers, reputations, inheritances depended on maintaining the illusion of sanctity. Better to question the hunter than the holy women. That's how it works even now. The institution protects itself, sacrificing the few who see too much to preserve the many who profit. Ask yourself, who benefits from obedience? Who profits when your impulses are managed, your rage neutralized, your free thought pathologized? The Ashfords were ahead of their time, but they were also a test, a proving ground for techniques that would later become mainstream in asylums, schools, military training, and corporate hierarchies. When you see the patterns, you can't unsee them. The same architecture, the same language of care, the same correction of deviance. The convent was only the first draft. The world you live in now is the published edition. And if you're listening this far, you're beginning to peel away the surface story and glimpse the machinery beneath. Keep listening, because the descent only deepens from here. You've heard their names. You've glimpsed the stone corridors. But you haven't yet seen the mechanism itself. The psychological engine turning beneath the surface. The Ashfords understood something most rulers still struggle to grasp. Physical chains can be broken, but mental ones become self-tightening. Inside their convent, no guards carried whips. No prisoners were shackled to walls. The true captivity was internal, engineered through ritual, deprivation, and carefully sequenced suggestion. Women were woken at shifting hours, forced to recite new prayers, denied their native tongue, fed bland food spiked with herbal sedatives. Each day a little more of their old identity dissolved, replaced with a new script. By week 3, most obeyed automatically. By month 3, they no longer remembered a time before obedience. Agatha called it stripping the false self. Prudence refined the procedures like a surgeon fine-tuning an operation. And Temperance, with her dark, magnetic gaze, became the initiator of metamorphosis, a living emblem of submission rewarded and rebellion punished. This was psychological control before there was even a term for it. And here's where it reaches you. These techniques didn't die with the Ashfords. They were studied, absorbed, and redeployed by institutions that still shape your thinking now, from corporate scripts to political slogans, from advertising triggers to social media loops. The same principles reappear. Break identity, install a new one, reward compliance, isolate dissent. This is not folklore, it's the quiet architecture of modern power. If you're still here, it's because some part of you recognizes the pattern. Some part of you refuses to be rewritten. I want you to anchor that part right now. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see the hidden pattern," twice. Not once, twice. Lock it in, make it visible. When you do, you aren't just playing with an algorithm. You're signaling to yourself, to others, and to whatever watches these spaces that you've seen through the veil. The Ashfords believed their methods would produce perfect compliance. What they could never anticipate is that their blueprint, once exposed, becomes the map of its own undoing. By seeing how they built their cage, you're already stepping outside it. This is how identity begins to reform, not as they designed it, but as you choose it. To understand how the Ashfords rose to such monstrous confidence, you have to follow their bloodline backward, past the convent, past England, deep into the murk of Europe's occult aristocracy. Agatha wasn't just a nun with strange ideas. She was the last daughter of a family whose name appears in alchemical treatises, heresy trials, and private Vatican censures dating back to the mid-1500s. Their crest, a black serpent devouring its own tail, was rumored to appear on coded manuscripts, traded only between the most radical medical philosophers of the age. These were the thinkers who believed the human soul could be engineered, who studied anatomy not to heal, but to command. When political winds shifted, their texts were burned and their estates confiscated, but their networks persisted underground. By the time Agatha was born, the Ashford fortune had been laundered through shipping, banking, and discreet patronage of moral reform societies. The convent in Maine was merely a continuation of a European tradition. Hidden laboratories disguised as monasteries, asylums, and retreat houses, where the boundaries between ritual, medicine, and power were deliberately erased. Their secret wasn't simply cruelty, it was synthesis fusing theology, early neuroscience, and ceremonial magic into a single system of influence. They believed trauma opened the door, language rewrote the code, and rituals sealed the new identity. That's why the convent's architecture mirrored medieval cathedrals, while its basement resembled a surgeon's theater. It was a temple laboratory, a machine for remaking souls. And that's why their work still haunts modern institutions. Look at the structures around you. School buildings, prisons, hospitals, corporate campuses. The geometry of corridors, the timing of bells, the cold efficiency of paperwork. These are faint echoes of the Ashford method. By mid-1803, their influence had grown so powerful that even whispers of wrongdoing were neutralized before they reached public ears. Deacon Morrison's questions faded under a haze of charitable donations and high-placed letters from Boston. Families who lost daughters signed legal settlements that buried their grievances forever. And yet, within their own journals, the Ashfords recorded a growing obsession, perfecting the moment when a human will breaks, capturing that instant and transforming it into a lifelong reflex. This was their holy grail, not death, but living compliance. By 1804, the Ashfords were no longer simply running a hidden convent. They were piloting a model of power transmission. Their graduates, women who survived the full cycle, were placed back into society as obedient wives, compliant servants, docile governesses, and even informants for powerful men. Each one carried subtle conditioning cues, post-hypnotic triggers buried in prayers and gestures, designed to activate obedience under certain circumstances. This was social engineering 2 centuries before the term existed, and it sent invisible ripples through New England households. When you study court records from that period, you find sudden reversals, rebellious daughters becoming paragons overnight, scandal-prone wives retreating into silence, family fortunes stabilizing as dissent simply evaporated. On paper it looked like moral reform. In reality it was a field test of mass compliance. Inside the convent, the methods grew more sophisticated. Agatha began experimenting with memory partitioning, isolating traumatic experiences behind mental walls so a subject could function outwardly while remaining malleable beneath. Prudence refined surgical interventions to disrupt or enhance specific emotional responses. Temperance developed entire ritual sequences, timed with lunar cycles and deprivation schedules, believing celestial rhythms amplified suggestibility. Their journals read like a hybrid of anatomy textbook and grim liturgy. And always, the same goal: create a self-policing human, a body whose reflexes enforce control without external chains. Meanwhile, benefactors in Boston and London received sealed reports, charts of behavioral changes, recovery times, obedience indices. Those papers vanished into private archives, but their ideas resurfaced later in moral treatment, asylums, industrial schools, military conditioning programs, and eventually, corporate management theories. The Ashfords weren't aberrations, they were the bleeding edge of an enduring project to transform human will into a predictable resource. As you're listening now, understand this: their blueprint didn't die. It simply scaled up, became less obvious, and migrated into institutions you interact with daily. The script you're hearing isn't folklore, it's a mirror. The same corridors they built echo in the places you walk. The same language of care cloaks policies shaping your choices. You can feel it already. A tightening at the edge of perception, the recognition that something vast and ancient has been steering more than just history. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. By the winter of 1805, tiny fractures began to appear in the Ashfords' immaculate facade. A few of their graduates returned to society, carrying something the sisters hadn't planned for, stray memories bleeding through the walls of their minds. They'd wake in the night speaking in strange tongues, sketching floor plans of the convent from memory or scrawling symbols they couldn't understand. One young woman in Portland carved a serpent devouring its tail into her own arm and murmured, "They are still inside me." Another in Boston tried to warn a pastor about the temple under the snow before vanishing again. The Ashfords dismissed these cases as spiritual relapses, but their benefactors were alarmed. The Meridian Circle had invested heavily in a method to produce perfect compliance, not unstable witnesses. Meanwhile, Thomas Brewster, still haunted by what he'd seen through that basement window, began collecting affidavits from families whose daughters had changed too dramatically. He found a sympathetic contact in a regional newspaper, but every attempt to publish was blocked by anonymous legal threats. When he tried to speak at a town meeting, the hall mysteriously caught fire the night before. His friends began dying in hunting accidents. The message was clear: the machine protected itself. Inside the convent, Agatha doubled down. If cracks appeared, she would build stronger walls. Prudence devised harsher protocols: deeper isolation, longer sedation, more invasive procedures. Temperance developed a chilling ritual called the second baptism, a night-long immersion in icy water, combined with whispered catechisms, meant to freeze old memories into oblivion. Some women did not survive. Those who did emerged eerily blank, as if their souls had been wiped clean. But power always overreaches. In her private journal, Agatha wrote of voices in the walls and patterns speaking back. The architecture they'd built to erase individuality was beginning to collective with something else. A collective was stirring in the broken minds of their subjects. Even the staff noticed doors opening on their own, prayers whispered from empty rooms, and the faint smell of brine where no water stood. Whether psychological backlash or something older than them moving through their ritual space, the Ashfords had awakened forces they couldn't fully control. By spring of 1806, the convent's silence began to tremble. At night, low moans seeped through the stone corridors even when no patients were present. Temperance, usually composed, started waking from nightmares with claw marks on her own arms. Prudence, ever the rationalist, wrote in her notes that the residue of broken minds was creating a field of suggestion inside the building, an accidental collective consciousness. Yet she didn't stop. She tried to measure it, to harness it, to turn the women's trauma into another tool. Agatha saw it differently. In her private entries she wrote of the well beneath the floor and voices like salt water. She feared something older than science, something they had summoned by fusing ritual and anatomy. Meanwhile, outside, Thomas Brewster pushed harder. He found 2 ex-servants of the convent who had fled during construction. They described sealed sublevels, iron cages, and a hidden stair spiraling far below the basement. When he showed them the serpent symbol carved by a Portland girl, both turned pale. They'd seen it burned into wooden crates unloaded at night. Thomas began compiling a dossier, dates, names, maps, planning to deliver it to a federal marshal in Boston. But even as he prepared, he felt eyes on him. His traps were sprung without animals. Strange notes appeared on his doorstep, written in a hand he didn't recognize. "Stop digging or you'll be buried." Inside, the women, subjected to second baptism, began speaking in unison, repeating fragments of forgotten languages, counting backward, predicting deaths that later occurred. Prudence thought it was mass hysteria. Agatha whispered that it was the serpent awakening. Temperance began to falter during rituals, staring at the ceiling as if something stared back. The convent itself had become a living diagram, an instrument amplifying every wound, every whispered prayer, every cut of the scalpel. The Meridian Circle grew impatient. Their Boston liaison demanded results or closure. But shutting down the experiment risked exposure. Too many families, too much money, too many vanished lives. And so the sisters pushed forward into the teeth of the storm they had created. Each procedure became more frantic, each ritual more desperate, trying to patch cracks in a dam whose foundation was already crumbling. Something was about to break. Inside the convent, inside their minds, and inside the hidden network that had believed itself untouchable. Summer of 1806 arrived like a fever. The forest around the convent, once alive with birdsong, turned unnaturally still. Locals whispered about a sour metallic scent drifting from the stone walls, about lights flickering through the trees at impossible hours. Inside, the sisters were unraveling. Prudence's handwriting became jagged, filled with frantic diagrams of spirals and eyes. Temperance began fasting, convinced that the serpent was preparing to emerge physically from the basement well. Agatha, once a figure of absolute command, stopped appearing in public at all, retreating to her private chamber and scribbling prayers over and over in Latin, English, and something no one could identify. The experiment had crossed into obsession. Women under their care no longer emerged as docile subjects. Some lay in catatonic silence. Others erupted into violent seizures, chanting the same six-word phrase in unison. Visitors reported hearing two sounds at once. Women sobbing and something deeper. A low bass tone like distant thunder vibrating under the floor. One terrified servant swore he saw dozens of pale hands pushing outward from the stone walls before he fled into the woods. Whether hallucination or not, fear had spread like a contagion. Thomas Brewster finally reached Boston with his dossier, but instead of finding protection, he found a wall of secrecy. Federal authorities lost his evidence. Hotel staff claimed they'd never seen him after the second night. His last known letter, mailed to a friend in Portland, contained only one line: "They are already here." After that, Thomas vanished from history, another loose end neatly tied. Back in Maine, the Ashfords prepared one last ritual, an accelerated purification, designed to erase the lingering fragments of memory and bind their subjects completely. It was scheduled for the solstice. Survivors later whispered of women marched into the basement and never coming back, of oil lamps burning blue, of a roar beneath the convent like the sea opening up. The sisters believed they were sealing their power, but in truth they were triggering its collapse. On the night of the solstice, the convent became a crucible. Architecture, ritual, and hundreds of broken minds fusing into something uncontrollable. And in that moment, the Ashford family's secret legacy would finally burst into the open, no longer hidden, no longer contained. The solstice of 1806 would later be remembered in whispers as the night of the tunnels. No one saw exactly what happened inside the convent, yet the aftermath became impossible to hide. At dawn, a thin veil of mist rolled from the building and settled over the nearby marshes. Farm animals bolted. Villagers awoke to an odor of brine and iron. By mid-morning, the convent's bell tower cracked down the middle, its bell tolling once without a hand to pull the rope. When the first outsiders arrived, they found the doors ajar and the corridors empty. Candles still burned. Food sat untouched. There was no sign of the sisters or the women under their care. Only their clothes folded neatly on cots, like a mass exodus had taken place in a single breath. The basement was worse. Every stone seemed slick, as though submerged in seawater, though no pipe had burst. Symbols carved into the floor glowed faintly, then faded when touched. In the deepest chamber, a spiral staircase led down into earth, but ended in collapsed rubble and a dark fissure that exhaled cold air. A single journal lay on a lectern, the final page written in Agatha's hand, reedy. The serpent rises in silence. After that, nothing. Authorities moved fast. Within days, the site was cordoned off under the pretext of structural danger. Boston newspapers ran a single small notice about a fire and collapse. Families of the missing were given vague assurances and relocation stipends. The Meridian Circle swept in quietly, removing boxes of documents, shipping crates of unknown contents downriver at night. Within a month, the convent was abandoned, its records sealed, its name struck from parish ledgers. By winter, all that remained were rumors and a blackened ruin overtaken by snow, yet the story didn't end there. Survivors of the program, the few who escaped before the solstice, began showing up in scattered towns, muttering about blue fires, doors underwater, and the sisters without faces. Some carried the serpent symbol carved into their palms, as if branded from the inside. They were dismissed as lunatics, but their accounts matched details hidden in Brewster's lost dossier. For those who know where to look, Section 11 isn't an ending at all, but a gateway. Proof that the Ashford's experiment reached its inevitable breaking point, and that whatever they unleashed in that basement was never truly buried. In the years after the convent's disappearance, the Ashford story mutated into a quiet legend, part cautionary tale, part conspiracy, part ghost story told on winter nights. But beneath the folklore, real power was consolidating. The Meridian Circle did not dissolve. It adapted. By 1810, its surviving members had folded their money and research into a string of new or reform institutions, charitable hospitals, industrial schools, and experimental prisons. Their stated mission was rehabilitation and moral uplift. Their hidden goal was to keep refining the template first tested under the Maine snow. Through grants and university endowments, their ideas spread into the nascent fields of psychiatry, social work, and scientific management. Terms like moral treatment and behavioral hygiene entered the public lexicon, soft words masking hard control. Pieces of the convent's architecture began appearing elsewhere, the same radial layouts, the same mirrored corridors, the same surveillance sightlines disguised as chapel windows. Even the language of confession and progress reports mirrored the journals once kept by Prudence and Temperance. By mid-century, these designs shaped asylums across New England. Few realized they were walking through faint echoes of a vanished experiment. Meanwhile, rumors persisted that a handful of the original women, those who vanished on solstice night, still lived, altered but alive, serving as advisors, mediums, or anonymous benefactors in Boston's secret societies. Their descendants show up in genealogies under new surnames, bearing the same serpent motif hidden in jewelry or carved on family headstones. Whether myth or misdirection, it ensured the Ashford legacy remained cloaked in mystery. For ordinary people, the lesson was simpler. Obedience became normalized. By presenting control as care and correction as compassion, the Meridian Circle managed to export the convent's core philosophy without triggering the outrage the Ashfords once provoked. The ghost story distracted from the living system. Even now, traces of their thinking can be found in modern institutional blueprints, policy language, and therapeutic regimens that assume compliance is the natural endpoint of healing. By the turn of the 20th century, the Ashford legend had become a footnote in local histories, but its architecture of control lived on, refined, repackaged, and stripped of overt mysticism. The Meridian Circle's descendants occupied chairs at medical schools, advised on public health policy, and designed the earliest vocational, character schools. Even the terminology shifted from moral hygiene to behavioral science. To the public, it looked like progress clinics replacing almshouses, classrooms replacing child labor, but hidden inside the reforms were familiar mechanisms: sensory deprivation, identity erasure, ritualized schedules, all meant to standardize the human being into a predictable unit. This was also the era when governments, industries, and militaries began funding large-scale studies on conditioning. The same principles Agatha once scribbled in candlelight now appeared in official reports on educational efficiency, soldier morale, and psychological adjustment. In factories, bells dictated breaks. In schools, time testing replaced exploration. In hospitals, patients were reduced to numbers on clipboards. Each space mirrored the convent's blueprint. Corridors funneling movement, rules suppressing spontaneity, authority cloaked in benevolence. The serpent icon disappeared from public view, yet it migrated into subtler symbols, logos, mottos, discrete carvings in cornerstones. Those who knew how to look could still find its coiled shape, hidden in institutional seals or abstract emblems. Whisper networks among reformers spoke of the pattern, a code word for the original Ashford philosophy. For ordinary citizens, the new century promised opportunity, but it also normalized surveillance and compliance. Public schools graded character, as well as academics. Workplaces measured attitude alongside output. People learned to monitor themselves long before an overseer appeared, just as the Ashfords had intended. And now, more than 100 years later, the mechanisms have become so seamless we rarely question them. From scrolling feeds to standardized workplaces, we move inside invisible corridors designed to extract attention, loyalty, and conformity. Section 13 isn't a ghost story, it's a mirror of the present. If the convent was the prototype, our world is the finished model, a cathedral of soft control built on data rather than stone. Recognizing that is the first act of defiance, the first fracture in the pattern. Look around you now, not at the screen, but at the architecture of your own life. The walls are invisible, yet they're there. The pattern didn't die with the Ashfords or the Meridian Circle, it evolved. Your phone vibrates with the same Pavlovian regularity as the bells in the Ashford halls. Your work calendar divides your day into squares of obedience. The metrics you're judged by, productivity, credit score, compliance to policies you never wrote, are the new leather straps. No one needs to drag you into a basement anymore. The basement has been uploaded into the cloud, and you voluntarily log in every morning. Power long ago learned that open tyranny provokes rebellion, but covert engineering breeds devotion. This is the new priesthood of influence, algorithms, behavioral economists, surveillance capitalists. They whisper in your feed, predict your desires, and map your weaknesses. The serpent coiled in the Ashford crest now lives as a stream of code, a looping pattern of inputs and triggers designed to sculpt not just your decisions, but your sense of self. The true danger is that the pattern feels natural. Like the women in the convent's upper rooms, we move with a strange mechanical precision, scrolling, liking, reacting, performing for invisible overseers. We accept smaller and smaller corridors of thought as the price of belonging. We have been taught to see obedience as safety and conformity as virtue. This is why so many men feel restless, but cannot name the cage. It's built from habits, rewards, and fears woven into daily life. This is where you decide if you will stay asleep or wake up. Waking up isn't about rejecting technology. It's about reclaiming sovereignty of attention, identity, and inner narrative. It's about recognizing the invisible corridors and choosing your own path through them. Right now, write in the comments, I see the pattern, I break the pattern. Write it twice, not as a superstition, but as a public commitment to reprogram your own reflexes. The act of stating it out loud forces your nervous system to mark the moment as a turning point. This is how you begin to break the quiet hypnosis. This is how you step off the assembly line of souls and reclaim your own design. If you've come this far, you already sense it. The pattern isn't just an external system. It's been installed inside you. Every reaction, every impulse to scroll, to compare, to self-censor, is a micro-program of obedience. The Ashfords knew this true control begins not with chains but with beliefs. And here is the deepest secret their descendants never wanted you to hear. The pattern can't fully govern a man who can see it operating in real time. Awareness itself is the first fracture. Once you can map its corridors, you can start to dismantle them from the inside out. That dismantling begins quietly. Instead of defaulting to the next stimulus, you pause. Instead of reflexively agreeing, you ask why. Every time you interrupt an automatic behavior, you reclaim territory in your own nervous system. This is what the Ashfords feared most. Not revolt in the streets, but revolt of the individual mind. Because one man who has reclaimed his attention can't be steered like a herd animal. And if enough men do it, the entire infrastructure of covert control collapses under its own weight. Start by studying your routines like an anthropologist. Where does your time go? Who profits from your attention? What stories about yourself have you been repeating that don't actually belong to you? Those stories are the hidden levers. Pull them out, one by one, and watch the false identity unravel. Replace them not with new slogans, but with silence, space, and chosen action. And understand this: the pattern will resist. It's designed to produce fatigue, to lure you back with comfort, to shame you for stepping outside. This is why the Ashfords wrap their experiments in the language of salvation, the illusion of safety. Break that illusion. Stand in the discomfort of your own autonomy until it becomes strength. When you begin this work, you may feel as though you're walking away from everything familiar. That's because you're leaving a manufactured self and entering the uncharted terrain of your own design. This is the counter-ritual. This is the true inheritance denied to generations of men. And now, as you hear these words, you hold the knife that cuts the final thread,